thanks to you all so much for coming. I know it's sort of early, so I appreciate you all making it out. So today what I want to argue is that if epistemic permissivism is true, which I'm going to explain in a second, then two objections to Pascal's wager fail. And more specifically, what I want to argue is that the defender of the wager has powerful responses to these objections, that these responses are more powerful than the responses previously provided in the literature. So what I want to do today is I'm going to explain Pascal's wager and explain epistemic permissivism, and then basically argue for three premises. The first is that if epistemic permissivism is true, then epistemic permissivism about theism is true. And then I want to argue that if epistemic permissivism about theism is true, one has control over their theistic beliefs. So what I'm calling the impossibility objection fails. And then also, if epistemic permissivism about theism is true, then one's belief that's formed as a result of wagering will not be epistemically irrational, so the irrationality objection fails. Okay, so let's start with Pascal's wager. So many theistic arguments that you guys might be familiar with simply conclude that God exists. The ontological argument, the cosmological argument, these kinds of things. And Pascal's wager is a little bit of a different argument because the conclusion is not that God exists, but rather that we should believe in God, or we have a good practical reason to believe in God. So on your handout, also, sorry, I don't know if there's enough handouts, but hopefully most everyone has one. On your handout, I have a basic chart that kind of explains a really basic version of Pascal's wager. So according to Pascal's wager, there's kind of two things you can do. You can believe in God, or you cannot believe in God. And there's two states of the world. Either God exists or God doesn't exist. And N represents the probability that God exists. And so you have a strong practical reason, according to this matrix, to believe in God. Because if God exists and you believe in God, you potentially have an infinite gain. But if you don't believe, you potentially have an infinite loss. And if God doesn't exist, whatever you gain or lose is finite. That's represented by F1 and F2 on the matrix. So this is a really basic argument. There's a lot of objections to it. There are a couple assumptions I'm just going to make for the purposes of this talk. The first is that N, which is the probability that God exists, is non-zero and non-infinitesimal. And the second is that we have a meaningful way to use decision theory to compare infinite options. I also will focus on the basic decision of whether to be a theist or not. I acknowledge things get much more complex when we bring in theological doctrines of specific religions. So I'm kind of setting aside the many gods objection for the purposes of this talk. I acknowledge, yes, things get more complicated, but we can also just think about the decision of whether to believe in God or not, and I think that's a meaningful thing we can think. Do I have a practical reason to be a theist or not? Kind of setting aside which type of theism I pick, whether that's Christianity or Islam or something else. And then finally, I'm going to kind of take the perspective of someone who's at least in some sense a seeker. So I think my argument might not apply to someone who's just totally and utterly convinced atheism is true. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Okay, so even setting aside those assumptions, which that was kind of a lot of assumptions, there's still two objections to Pascal's wager, and those are the two I'm going to focus on today. And the first is the impossibility objection, at least that's what I'm going to call it. And the impossibility objection says it's impossible to wager because we don't have the right kind of control over our beliefs. And at the little chart of the bottom of your handout, I kind of give a list of people who discuss or make this objection. The second objection is the irrationality objection, and this objection says that beliefs that are formed for practical reasons are epistemically irrational and thus defective. So one example is wishful thinking. If I believe something just because I want it to be true, a lot of times people think that's going to be epistemically irrational. You shouldn't have that belief. At least from an epistemic perspective, that belief is very problematic. And I sort of mentioned this already, but again, there's a ton of other objections to the wager, the many gods objection, the mixed strategies objection. Some people think wagering is like immoral. So I'm just going to set those objections aside for now. I've actually talked about some of them in some of my other work. If you want to talk about them in Q&A, I'm totally fine with that. But I'm just going to set those aside and focus on these two, the impossibility objection and the irrationality objection. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about epistemic permissivism. So epistemic permissivism is the view that some bodies of evidence permit more than one rational doxastic attitude towards a particular proposition. So here's kind of an intuitive example of epistemic permissivism. two jurors might be trying to decide whether Smith is guilty. They might sit through all the same hearings, hear all the same arguments by all the same lawyers, and thus have all the same evidence that bears on whether Smith is guilty. But one juror might think Smith is guilty, and the other might think Smith is innocent, and neither juror is being irrational. So the thought is, if epistemic permissivism is true, at least in some cases, people can share evidence but come to different conclusions about whether some proposition is true without either of them compromising rationality. Okay, so the permissivism that I'm going to invoke here, I guess the example I was just giving was involving two different people who share evidence. But the permissivism I'm going to kind of invoke here and sort of assume is true is intrapersonal as opposed to interpersonal. So intrapersonal permissivism involves a single agent and her evidence, as opposed to two agents that share evidence. And also for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to focus on permissivism about belief, as opposed to permissivism about credence. Credence is this attitude some epistemologists talk about that's kind of like someone's confidence levels put on a probability scale from 0 to 1. So I think some things I say in this talk will apply to permissivism about credences, but I'm just going to focus on belief, where for every proposition you can either believe it, withhold on it, or disbelieve it. Okay, so this brings me to the first premise of my argument, which says, if permissivism is true, then at least for most bodies of evidence that many people actually have, permissivism is true with respect to theistic belief or with respect to the proposition God exists. And so again, I talked about people that are just like very, very, very convinced atheism is true. Maybe they do have some kind of really strong reason for believing atheism. Those people probably aren't going to apply in my argument, but for people that either their body of evidence is permits atheism, agnosticism, and theism, or agnosticism and theism, those are the kind of people that my argument is going to apply to. Okay, so why think that if permissivism is true, permissivism is true about theistic belief? Well, I think first, this is sort of a cheap reason, but the proposition God exists is frequently used as an example of permissive cases, and many people like Miriam Schoenfield sort of give this as a paradigm example of a case where people could share evidence, but nonetheless come to different conclusions. So again, this doesn't apply to everyone, but I think a lot of us kind of fall somewhere in the middle, right? There's a lot of interesting arguments for God's existence, the design argument, the fine-tuning argument, the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, but there's also some compelling reasons to think God doesn't exist. The problem of evil, the problem of divine hiddenness. There's been a long, ongoing debate, long history, many arguments on each side, and objections and replies, and there's just a lot of good evidence pointing both ways. And further, there's many smart people, even so-called experts, maybe philosophers or philosophers of religion, who disagree about whether God exists. And so what I want to say here is, if we already think epistemic permissivism is true, then it seems like atheists, agnostics, and theists can all be potentially epistemically irrational, even if they have or are aware of the same evidence. And a quick caveat here, this obviously doesn't mean we all have the same evidence with respect to whether God exists, but just that for a lot of our bodies of evidence, multiple attitudes towards God's existence are rationally permitted. And look, there could be theists that have these super significant religious experiences that make it such that their evidence just determines they should believe God exists or even entails that God exists. And that's fine for me because they're already kind of wagering, so I'm not really worried about that. There's the atheist that's so convinced that God doesn't exist. I've kind of already acknowledged that's not the person I'm thinking about. So it's going to be sort of these cases in the middle. And if I'm already assuming permissivism is true, some bodies of evidence are permissive in this way, I don't really see why this couldn't be true with respect to the question of theism. Okay, so one objection, especially an objection I might get at a conference like this, is like, look, doesn't Paul argue in Romans 1 that theism has some kind of privileged status and that God's attributes are revealed in such a way that people are without excuse? And I totally acknowledge and agree with the Bible. That's good. But I think, and what I want to talk about in the conclusion is that I actually think that there's good reason to think that the privileged status of theism is not epistemic, but rather it's practical. And once we kind of see why these objections to Pascal's wager don't apply anymore, I want to say that what the privilege, at least one important privileged status that theism has isn't one that's on an epistemic dimension, but it's one that's on a practical dimension, that we have a good reason to believe in God rather than not believe in God because of what's at stake. So I still think I can capture something along the lines of what Paul's getting at in Romans 1, even if it's kind of giving a slightly different take on it. Okay, so that's basically my defense of the premise that if permissivism is true, then permissivism is true about theistic belief. And again, recall I'm not arguing that permissivism is true. I'm assuming that. And then I'm arguing that if we think permissivism is true, we have a good reason to think that it applies in the theistic case. Okay, now I'm going to move on to look at premise 2. So the impossibility objection says wagering is impossible because we don't have the right kind of control over our beliefs. And they say, look, even if you present Pascal's wager, you say you have this great argument to believe in God. Well, I'm just an agnostic or I'm just an atheist and I just can't make myself be a theist. And a lot of people talk about this, Ward, Duff, Mackey, Jordan. And another way to sort of put a sharp point on this argument is, look, ought implies can. I can't control my beliefs. Therefore, it can't be the case that I ought to believe in God. So Pascal's wager fails. And another thing to note here that sort of supports this argument is I do think, kind of independently of Pascal's wager, when you just look at the epistemology literature, the orthodoxy is that we can't change our beliefs at will. Alston famously argues for this, Bennett, Hieronymy, many others. So a lot of people just take this as a datum, for example. Oh, of course we can't control our beliefs. So this brings me to kind of an old, more concessive response that some people have given to this, actually including Pascal himself, which says, instead of directly changing our beliefs, the wager should motivate us to make other lifestyle changes, like going to church, praying, participating in religious rituals, participating in a religious community, that kind of thing. And so a lot of people, including Mike Rhoda in his new book, some of you guys might be familiar with, Taking Pascal's Wager, sort of say, let's not make this about belief anymore, let's make this about something else, like committing your life to God, or committing to go to church, or committing to not doing certain things that most religions teach are immoral, even if you wouldn't have otherwise thought those were immoral, that sort of thing. So they make it like an action-focused thing, not a belief-focused thing. And I think there's something to be said for that. And I think maybe for some of the agents that aren't in the permissive cases that I'm thinking of, that could be a really good argument for that. And I've actually used that argument in some of my earlier work. But I think, sorry, I'm struggling with these papers. I think that if permissivism is true, we can actually give a more direct permissive response to this objection to the wager. And that's because if permissivism is true, and if an agent finds themselves in a permissive case, this makes space for agents in these permissive cases to actually change their beliefs directly. And I'm very open to the idea that this actually means that in some permissive cases, we could have direct control over our beliefs and kind of move them around at will. But a weaker version of my argument would at least say, when you find yourself in a permissive case, we have more control over our beliefs than if we just think, well, my evidence just directly points to P, or my evidence makes it such that I ought to withhold belief, for example. So one thing, a lot of people who have kind of been interested in just in the epistemology of doxastic voluntarism and voluntarism literature, they've sort of noted look, in all these arguments for doxastic involuntarism, they're sort of assuming in the background that uniqueness is true. And the idea behind these arguments is something like this. Well, look, beliefs aim at truth. If you believe something, what you're kind of doing is you're taking that thing to be true. And so you have to pick the attitude when you're thinking about which attitude you should have towards P, for example, that you think is most likely to be true. If you pick an attitude for a practical reason, for example, and not because you think it's the most likely to be true, that's not a belief anymore. That's like accepting or that's something else. So if you have direct control or you can change it at will, it's not actually a belief. Beliefs are these things that aim at truth, and it's basically a commitment to the world being such that P, and so you must pick the one attitude that you take to be most likely to be true. However, these arguments totally overlook the possibility that you find yourself in a permissive case, and your evidence underdetermines what you ought to believe. In a permissive case, let's say you're in between agnosticism and theism. If you find yourself in this case, both of these options are going to be live for you, and you take either one as equally appropriate. or as equally likely to be true. I mean, that's weird because if agnosticism is one of the choices, then that might not work, but take theism and atheism, for example. And so if both beliefs are live for you in this way, it seems like it's a very different situation, and it actually seems like you can pick between them and even do so without compromising rationality. So I also want to note, so some people think what doxastic voluntarism means is that we have control over our beliefs in the same way we have control over raising our hand. Like, it's a so-called basic action. So you can kind of do it in one uninterrupted act of will without kind of any intermediate acts in between. But that isn't required for direct voluntary control. And here's why. I have total control over whether I go clean the kitchen, or whether I rearrange my bedroom furniture, or whether I make dinner. Even though I can't do these things in like one uninterrupted act like I can raise my hand, but over a series of acts, I have full control over whether I've made dinner or whether I've cleaned the kitchen. And so belief doesn't have to be a so-called basic action in order for us to have voluntary control over our beliefs. So I also want to note that might just not mean like you just directly believe, but it might mean there's a series of actions you undertake, but you do have control over the outcome. Okay, so if, as I have argued earlier, many of us are in a permissive situation with respect to our evidence and the proposition God exists, then I think we might actually have a lot more control over whether we believe that God exists than we might think. And I also think another thing to note here too is that this might just not involve just changing our attitude towards one proposition, whether God exists. But this might actually involve kind of going in between two competing worldviews. And some of you guys might know John Pittard. He's at Yale. He has this really cool paper where he basically argues the problem in the doxastic voluntarism literature is people have been so focused on a single proposition, but if you just change your attitude towards that one proposition, it's probably going to be totally incoherent with the rest of your beliefs. And instead, the best way to think about voluntarism is thinking about one worldview versus another worldview and kind of switching or picking between them. And as a side note, Peter Van Inwagen has this kind of like autobiography of his Christian faith, and it's really interesting because he kind of talks about how he could see the world as if it was created, and he could see the world as if it wasn't, and how like kind of moving in between these two perspectives and then kind of landing on seeing the world as created was sort of the way he came to faith. And so I actually think this kind of thing is a lot more common than people acknowledge, and like people in the doxastic voluntarism literature are just kind of ignoring these possibilities. So here's a worry. Why don't we think we have control over our theistic beliefs? I think a lot of people on reflection like hear this objection to Pascal's wager and they're like, yeah, this seems right, I can't just control my belief. So I think part of the reason is that we just haven't really fully reflected on our epistemic situation or thought about these sort of broader possibilities like competing worldviews rather than just thinking about a specific proposition. And I do think too that, especially because a lot of people who I talk to about this are philosophers, they're kind of just, they're kind of in this dogma that we just can't change our beliefs at will, especially epistemologists. And so they just kind of assume, like, of course I can't change my belief like that. But interestingly enough, like when you introduce the concept of doxastic voluntarism to students, there's, at least in my experience, there's at least a couple students who are like, oh yeah, I can totally change my belief that well if you give me money or something. And you might think, oh, they're just lying or something. But like the problem is that a lot of people, they say, oh, just believe 2 + 2 = 5 and then I'll give you, and it's like, of course you can't change that. Like that's definitely going to be a case where, an impermissive example, believing 2 + 2 = 5 given your evidence. There's no way. But I think if we think about these cases where our evidence is kind of more balanced, between two competing options, like someone who's really on the fence about gun control or something, then it's much more plausible that you could kind of change your belief at will. So I think we should take the testimony of our students more seriously in some cases. So, okay. So basically, that was maybe more of like a rant about the dogma than anything else, but hopefully there's at least an argument in there that if epistemic permissivism is true, we can kind of give a more direct response to this impossibility objection to the wager. Okay, finally, do I have 25 minutes or just 20 minutes? Another 20 minutes? You're joking. Oh, you mean counting Q&A? Yes. Okay. I should be done in like 5 minutes. Okay, cool. Okay, so now what I want to do is defend the third premise of my argument. And so let's first talk quickly about this objection to the wager. So according to this objection, wagering is impossible because beliefs that are formed on the basis of practical rather than epistemic reasons are epistemically defective. Recall the wishful thinking example I gave earlier. And this objection is actually like just almost everyone who talks about Pascal's wager talks about this objection, and a lot of people that object to Pascal's wager make this objection, so it's like a super common objection, and I think a lot of people think it's even potentially decisive. So I think an old, more concessive response that some people have given, I guess I only cited myself here, but I think other people have given this too, is that even if wagering is epistemically irrational, it can still be potentially, all things considered, rational. And so the thought is, I give this case where someone kidnaps your family, and then they give you a pill that's going to give you a false belief about the 500th digit of pi, and they say, I'll let your family go if you take this pill, and let's just say you know they're not lying. It seems like you should take the pill, even if taking the pill is epistemically irrational, because morally and all things considered, that seems like the appropriate thing to do. And so the thought is, well, look, even if there is something kind of epistemically bad about wagering, if you think it's likely it's going to give you a false belief or something like that, you could still have an all things considered practical or moral reason to do it. But I think that's a cool response that has some weight. But I also think we can give a way more direct, interesting, permissive response if epistemic permissivism is true. And so the thought is this: look, what if, looking at things from an epistemic perspective, things are left open? An epistemic rationality doesn't force one determinate doxastic attitude. If either attitude is possibly epistemically rational for you, then it's unclear why picking one for a practical reason would make the belief in question epistemically irrational. In fact, if you're in a permissive case and both theism and agnosticism are permitted for you, then actually by definition, whichever one you pick is going to be epistemically irrational. And it's unclear why then picking one for a practical reason would kind of compromise that epistemic rationality. And actually, picking one for a practical reason could explain why toggling between the attitudes is irrational, which is an objection that Roger White gives to permissivism. He says, why don't you just move in between them? But if you have practical reason to believe one, then you won't toggle. So very briefly, I just want to address a potential objection to this. So some people distinguish between propositional justification and doxastic justification. Propositional justification is just having, like, let's say evidentialism is true, for example. I have propositional justification for a belief if I just have evidence for that belief, even if that belief is based on wishful thinking or something. Doxastic justification is a stronger notion which says not only do I have evidence for that belief, but that belief is also based on that evidence. And so one might object to my argument here and say, well, look, these beliefs might be propositionally justified, but they're not doxastically justified because they're based on a practical reason. And so the first thing I want to say is, okay, fine. I'm good with just getting propositional justification. I think that's actually the kind of justification a lot of people talk about. And I'm okay with just like backing down and saying, well, at least I have propositional justification. But I also think the permissivism literature and then this like distinction between these two kinds of justification haven't really been interacting with each other. And I think there's an interesting debate to be had about whether, if you're in a permissive case and then you believe for a practical reason, if that renders your belief doxastically unjustified. And I kind of think it doesn't, because the point of a permissive case is that both options are epistemically permitted and live for you, and you can kind of pick either one. And if you pick one for no reason, why is that different than picking one for a practical reason? So I think it's actually unclear that these beliefs are going to be doxastically unjustified. But I'm open to sort of taking the weaker stance and saying, well, at least they're propositionally justified. Okay, great. So yeah, I basically have a chart on your handout kind of explaining the basics of the old concessive response and the new direct permissive response. And I want to conclude by saying that the defender of the wager, I think, has a good reason to take on board a permissive epistemology. On this picture, belief in God is rationally left open by our evidence, but nonetheless may be required by other things like our practical circumstances. So in this, even if theistic belief is not epistemically obligatory, it may nonetheless be practically obligatory. And I think that's a very important sense in which Romans 1 is true. So, thank you. Thanks, Ben. Thank you.
One brief constructive suggestion. So when it,
Yeah.
I think you're right, you don't do direct control. Indirect control will do as well. So Holston is very helpful for your service.
Yeah.
In the 1890s, on that, the deontological conception person.
Mm-hmm.
Go on with a critical question. Well, so you mentioned I want to swim across the ocean, but I can't swim. Then I can learn to swim. That removes the impediment, but that does not increase my control over swimming across the ocean. It's still possible. And I'm worried that something analogous is going on here. So realizing that another fantastic attitude would be irrational, that removes a certain barrier, but it doesn't increase my control. So if I'm on a jury and I'm convinced this person is innocent, and I realize, well, the people who think that this person is guilty are equally rational, I may realize that, but that doesn't give me control over just changing my existing attitude. So I think there's sort of an argumentative gap between the two. That's my worry. Maybe it can be crossed, but that's the worry I have.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I guess I don't want to say you always have that kind of control, but I think at least this blocks most of their reasons for thinking that doxastic voluntarism is true. And then, I mean, I guess I don't want to say doxastic involuntarism is true. Sorry. So I don't want to say like, oh, then voluntarism is under our control by default. But I just think it's way less clear that we don't have at least some kind of control over our beliefs when we're in this permissive case. I mean, it depends on the situation. I think sometimes I just like find myself thinking, yeah, I totally have control over whether I'm like theist or agnostic, and that's just kind of my experience. How do I prove that? I don't know. I think that's a difficult thing, and you might be right. I might have just removed a barrier, but I think at the very least I could fall back on sort of the second thing I said, which is that we have more control over our theistic beliefs, given that like our evidence doesn't just force us on pains of rationality to hold one attitude, and it might be this kind of indirect thing. But I still kind of think it could be the direct thing, but maybe I haven't given enough of an argument for that. But I think your question is really helpful in that it makes me think I need to be more clear about the kinds of control and what that looks like. But like I said before, I also don't think direct control means it has to be a basic action. So maybe I'm more just conceding, but that's helpful. So.
It was a great paper.
Thanks.
You always bring two different areas together. I guess I just wanted an elaboration about the work that epistemic permissivism is doing in taking down the impossibility objections. Specifically how it's taking down the irrationality objection.
Yeah.
I guess I'm concerned that what's really doing all the work and taking it down is accepting your form of doxastic voluntarism.
Okay.
It's for permissivism, all it's granting me is such that if I'm an agnostic, given my body of evidence, I'm rational. If I change my mind and I go theist, I'm still rational. But again, I thought the concern is supposed to be, I can't get myself right now to believe in God or accept the whole package. And that's why the old consensus response says, well, here's one way. You can go to church, you take the Eucharist, blah, 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 and eventually I will. So again, you want to say, well, no, here's a simpler way. Just will, not in this uninterrupted way, because that's not how most of our actions work.
Yeah.
But then it seems like what's doing the work there is that kind of doxastic voluntarism. So I guess if you just elaborate a little bit more, role epistemic permissivism is doing in taking down this objection.
Yeah, I think what I want to say is that there's like 3 ways you could have control over something. So the first is just this like uninterrupted act, like the raising the hand thing. You know what I mean? And I want to say, no, we don't have that. And then the third is this like very long-term kind of, actually the Alston paper might be helpful in this. It's sort of this long-term like kind of just indirect influence where you kind of like try to put yourself in situations where you might come to believe it. And I want to say like at the very least, the kind of control we have is in the middle. And that was sort of the washing the dishes or the rearranging furniture kind of cases. And maybe what I need to do, I mean, this is the very first draft of this paper too, so maybe what I need to do is kind of spell out in more detail what that would look like in the theistic case. And maybe that's kind of the thing I haven't given you. I tried to give some kind of thing where it's like you're sort of in between these two worldviews and you kind of choose to step into one or step into the other. And I do think a lot of people, which I maybe didn't cite in your handout but do have in the paper, they do think like, they argue like if permissivism is true, we can have at least this kind of like intermediately indirect but still voluntary control. So maybe what I need to do is kind of borrow from them and to like motivate this a little more. But I do want to say like the kind of control we have is not this like hand-raising control, but also not the kind Pascal was thinking of either, and like maybe even Mike Rhoda and them. But it is this like, I do have control over my beliefs. Because those people just throw belief to the wayside and they say, oh, just do these actions, you know what I mean? And I want to say no, like I think we can still make this about beliefs. If you notice on the first page, a lot of people, so in this chart, a lot of people change this to like wager for God or like commit to God or something, you know what I mean? And I don't want to do that. I want to say no, we can keep it about beliefs. Maybe it's going to look a little different than, you know, like the very crude first presentation of the wager, but I still think we can make it about our beliefs. So, yeah. Oh, thanks, Ben.
I have a lot of questions that maybe we can discuss afterwards.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Does your account of epistemic permissivism require a particular view on a more general epistemology? And here I'm thinking especially about Logan Gage's work on phenomenal conservatism. He thinks that brain states themselves are part of the evidence. So if you and I are looking at the same evidence and we apprehend evidence in different ways, then it follows from this that while we might be epistemic peers, we don't actually have the same evidence, because you can see that. So is that
good? Yeah, so I think one way to kind of at least bolster uniqueness, which is the denial of permissivism, is to just kind of say like evidence change is this super easy thing to come by, and like any kind of mental change is a change in evidence. And like, sure, then maybe there's always one unique attitude for every body of evidence, because like you never have the same evidence from one time to the other, and two people never ever share evidence. But I guess my thought is like that's kind of a boring kind of uniqueness, because evidence change is just so easy that there's always going to be one unique body attitude for every body of evidence, because there's just never the same body of evidence in two moments or for two people. So I was thinking of evidence in at least a slightly more restricted way than like maybe a mentalist phenomenal conservativist. I don't want to say that, I mean, I think definitely versions of phenomenal conservatism are consistent with permissivism. I think the other thing to note is I was thinking about intrapersonal permissivism, so it's like one agent and her evidence, but it still seems like given this notion of evidence, like from one second to the other, I would never have the same evidence, you know what I mean? So yeah, I think you can motivate uniqueness by just expanding what counts as evidence, but then that makes it, you start to get a borderline trivial thesis. So, yeah, but that's helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, Derek. Yeah. Hey.
So I want to just take a look at Pascal, tested response. So he does recommend these lifestyle changes, Eucharist, Mass, and all these things. But that's not the only thing he says, of course. And there's this trivial anachronistic worry about, you know, he comes even before the objections, but you do want him in the original. He does give a kind of response. He gives more. So he says that one word he uses in French is saboteur, which is it's reflexive. It's kind of from the root is bête, which can mean beast or stupid. So it's like literally to stupid yourself. Some translations mean to blunt your passions, or so this is an internalist picture of like what one is doing with one's will. So and then by definition, you're already in the permissivism case, because it's equally as likely that you're that you've got exist or not exist, take that person, and then he turns inward and says, you know, what you can do in that case if you still can't believe is to dead end or blunt your passions. So at that point it becomes a movement of the will to opt for one choice or the other, and that sounds a lot like your weaker version of what you're talking about.
Yeah, so I think it's really cool if Pascal had kind of like predicted this like epistemic permissivism thing that like supposedly started in 2005 with Roger White. So I actually should go back and look at the text, because I think it's easy to focus on the like go to Mass and get holy water and, you know, and kind of skip the part you're talking about. But I think the thing I want to avoid, and I'm not enough of a historian to know whether Pascal avoids this or not, but I definitely want to avoid this self-deception worry, which is whatever the stupiding or blunting yourself is doing is sort of ignoring evidence or ignoring what is truly epistemically rational for you, and instead taking some other path for a practical reason. I definitely want to say that's not what's going on here. What's going on here is they're both options are totally rational for you and like epistemically live for you, and in that sense you can pick between them without having to engage in self-deception. So I don't know if what Pascal, yeah, go ahead, yeah.
Say the same thing as he's recommending this, he's not recommending that you become stupid, because it's more of a medical. He's going to use it in a metaphorical way.
Yeah.
He's not just going to go out and say, make yourself stupid.
Yeah. So that's helpful. So maybe this is, I think in a way this would be cool if I could kind of quote it and be like, let's get some insight from like Pascal's first response here. So that's helpful. Yeah.
Got 4 minutes, so we're going to
Travis.
So my question is about epistemic permissivism itself, and
Yeah.
whether or not, is it the idea that the evidence has to be like kind of perfectly balanced in tension such that one can then sort of choose between the two? Because if it is, then I'm wondering how common that really is.
Yeah.
Where it's perfectly balanced that way. So then, in blocking, I think if I got this right, the impossibility objection, it may just block it for some. It may be very, very rare that it really does truly become possible. But if you say it's not, then you have this sort of awkward situation where one option has more evidence. Maybe they're close, but then one option does have more evidence, and then it doesn't seem so plausible that one can sort of just choose between the two.
Yeah.
I think how you said it was without compromising, the epistemology.
Yeah, I think this is a really deep question that, both gets into the nature of evidence and the nature of rationality. One thing you might think is maybe the evidence isn't perfectly balanced. Think about like a philosophical argument that you're kind of unsure whether it's true or not. Like, it might not be that your evidence is actually perfectly balanced between, whether nihilism about material objects is true or false, but you can't really perceive the difference. And so for you, at least, when you're kind of evaluating your evidence and thinking like, what should I believe given my evidence, it might as well be balanced. It's kind of, there's like maybe parity or something between the evidence for P and the evidence for not P. So it might not be that it requires it to be perfectly balanced, but kind of like from your perspective, it's balanced enough, at least. One interesting question is like, let's say I know I have a tiny bit more evidence for P than for not P. I think, at least with respect to beliefs, you could still potentially be in a permissive case, or you could be in a permissive case with respect to belief and withholding, even if, like, let's say I have evidence that makes P 51% probable, maybe then I should withhold, but I think it's going to be complicated, and I do think these cases hopefully are going to pop up more than you might think, especially because I don't think it has to be like perfectly balanced in order for it to for it to count. So, but yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a lot behind it. So, 1 minute.
Oh, every time?
We'll see. You know your question.
Okay, so Liz,
Yeah.
let's suppose that relative to a person's evidence, a P and not P are in rough epistemic. Doesn't have to be exact, but it could be rough. It could be a range there.
Yeah.
And so for all intents and purposes, for that person, they're counterbalanced. Now, what explains one's choice of P over not P? Is there a general answer to that question so that it's not context relative? Or does that depend on what it's about? Like a wager regarding God's existence, for example, where so much is at stake.
Yeah.
You've got the infinite and finite.
Yeah. So
could a person have as good a reason, whatever that is, or could the explanation for a person's choosing not to believe in God be just as good as a person's reason? Could the explanation be just as good for believing that God does not exist as for believing that God does exist in this context where this person has choice?
yeah, I think there's a couple questions there. So I do think sometimes what can kind of break this parity between P and not P is the practical reason. And that can kind of explain why we shouldn't just like believe P one day and then believe not P the next day, because you have a practical reason to believe one. But like Another case is, what if you don't have practical reason to believe one, but you're just kind of in this permissive case and like your beliefs are kind of left open? Well, then I think you're in situations that we encounter every day. You get up, you pour yourself a bowl of breakfast cereal, and there's 3 spoons in the drawer, and you pick one and you eat breakfast with it. And it wouldn't have been irrational for you to use one of the other 2 spoons, but there's no reason for you to like go back and forth and switch between spoons. Just like once you pick one, I mean, I guess maybe I'm just responding to the toggling objection, which wasn't your question, but I do think it could be that it's genuinely underdetermined both by your epistemic and your practical situation, but nonetheless, it might be okay for you to just pick an attitude and stick with it, and I don't see any reason to think you should go back and then move to other attitudes. Maybe if you get practical reason to do so or something like that, but then that would be disanalogous to the spoon case. Okay, we can talk more about the second thing later. Thank you.